Okay. So in about a year ago, over a year ago, I received this very interesting email from my second cousin who lives in Calgary in Alberta, and he and his wife were planning a trip to Tanzania and Uganda, and they were wondering whether anybody would be interested in going along with them. Well, my wife spent her first 2 years of her life that she doesn't remember about in Kenya. So she's always wanted to go back to that East African area and see some of the areas and animals and stuff that her parents used to tell stories about. So as soon as I got that email from my cousin, I quickly responded that yes, we'd be very interested in going. And it turned out there would be he and his wife, Gail, and I, and then one other woman from Florida were sort of the clients. And both parts of the trip in Tanzania and Uganda were organized trips where we'd hired local companies to drive us around, feed us, accommodate us, etc., and of course provide sort of knowledge about the worst of the area. We sort of the sessions were primarily, well, originally sort of focused on birds. We wanted to make sure we had birding expertise along with us, but of course we're interested in seeing everything. And you can just see from the title slide, for example, the kind of animal diversity you can get around a single water hole. So we flew into Tanzania, and the blue and red spots on here are the eBird locations where we recorded stuff. So you can see we kind of spread ourselves across northern Tanzania from the hills close to the coast out into the broader plains in Serengeti. And then we flew into Uganda over Lake Victoria and did a few more stops. That was a shorter 5 or 6 day trip. So I've decided that I wouldn't make this presentation a travel log that leads you from A to B to C. You don't really need to know the specifics of the geography to be able to really enjoy the biological diversity that we encountered along the way. So I've sort of packaged up the pictures and the narratives sort of based more on the biological side of things rather than the geography. And as I mentioned on the title slide, my wife Gail was the photographer for all these photographs, and I had the enjoyment of trying to go through probably thousands of slides, select the subset that I thought would be suitable for this kind of talk, and then out of that subset pull together a reasonable number so that I didn't talk for 3 or 4 hours. So it's a little hard to see this. This is often the case. This is Mount Kilimanjaro. It's in Tanzania. It's the highest mountain in Africa. And invariably, it's surrounded by clouds. So rarely do you get to see the top. There is snow on the top, so that's not all clouds. Some of it's the snow as well. So this is kind of where we started the trip. We flew into Kilimanjaro Airport. Sorry, I'm terrible with place names. So because this is the first animal on the title of the show, giraffes, I thought I'd start there and slowly work through the animal and plant kingdom as best as I could. Now, giraffes tend to hang around in constantly sort of changing groups. So they're very sort of loose affiliations with themselves because they're primarily browsers. They're usually in the open woodland or savanna with a few trees. So you won't get these animals out on the open plains.
Oh, gosh.
Somebody's not muted. Anyhow, Serengeti, which is one of the biggest national parks in Tanzania that goes over into the Kenyan border, it's estimated there's about 12,000 giraffes in that national park alone. And it's it is the national animal of Tanzania. Here are a few more photographs of the giraffe as demonstrating their browsing habitat. You know, that long neck has allowed them to get up to browse that's not used by other animals. And many of the mammals of Africa, you'll find these little birds hanging around on their backs after insects and that kind of stuff. So this in the bottom left, it's the red-billed oxpecker, which I think is a great name for it. And there's many sort of variations in the color and the exact patterning on giraffes, though all the ones that we saw were considered to be of the same subspecies. Of course, one of the other animals everybody wants to see when they go to Africa are the elephants. This is an elephant group. They're the largest living land mammal in the world. They use a whole variety of habitats, so you don't tend to get them out in the middle of the open grasslands, but often hanging around the outside or in the woodlands. And you can see these guys are all standing around in sort of a protective circle around their young because they obviously were a little wary about us. And just I'd like to say just a couple of words about the photography on this trip, because in most of the national parks, especially in Tanzania, you have to stay in your vehicle. You're not allowed to get out of your vehicle except at the camps or the lodges. So most of the photographs, or many of the photographs, are taken from the vehicle. And the amazing thing is, most of the animals totally ignore the vehicle. So you can often get very close to them. And what you're not being able to get close to, obviously, are some of the flowers and stuff, but that was not considered to be too much of a problem. There were some areas where we were able to get out and interact with the habitats directly. This is a family group. It's overseen by the oldest female in that group. And most of the bull elephants are off in other areas by themselves or in bachelor clubs, except during the breeding season. Here on the left, you have one of those solitary bull elephants that's meandering around. And on the right, you have another cow elephant with her young calf. The major threats to these animals are both ivory poaching and loss of habitat corridors between the areas where they live. So obviously one of the target groups that we wanted to see when we were in Africa were the cats. And this is actually, I think it was the third species of cat we saw. It's a leopard. Leopards are, they do their hunting on the ground, but they'll often take their prey up into the trees. And so they use those trees as a security. And as you can see, this tree has many, many spines on it. So they're obviously pretty tough animals. One of the ways you can tell some of the cats apart are by looking at the spots that they have. And the spots on these are kind of a rosette with sort of a circle of black spots with a brown central core. These animals tend to be fairly solitary except during the breeding times. Leopards are primarily nocturnal animals, and they use probably the broadest range of habitats of any of the wild cats there. So you'll get them in the forest, in the woodlands, and out on the open savannas. And this one that we encountered was on a lone tree out in the middle of a wide open grassland. It had an antelope of some sort that had taken up the tree, and there on the left, you can see all the blood on the face. It was busy engorging itself, having a big meal. Then after it finished the meal, it wandered to another area of the tree and started to lay down and relax, clean off all the blood out of its face. I think this is one of the nicest photographs my wife took on the trip. And this is that same leopard. It's cleaned up its face and it's ready. Its stomach is full and it's ready just to have a nap. Now, I mentioned that we in these national parks, you're in a safari vehicle, so you can't get out. But they're all sort of connected by radios. And when an animal like this is seen in a tree eating like this, all the word goes out to the local guides that, where the tree is. And the next thing you know, you'll have 12 or 15 vehicles surrounding that tree, everybody trying to jockey for, the best view. So it's amazing how the animals ignore all those vehicles and all those people in the vehicles. But of course, as I said, you have to stay in that vehicle. Another common animal of East Africa is the zebra or zebra, depends how you want to say it. Beautiful animal with the black and white stripes. and they tend to use the open to lightly wooded savanna, so they tend to be more an animal out in the open. Here's a view of quite a larger herd of zebra there, with a couple of wildebeest lying down. Now, zebra, especially in the Serengeti, as the dry season moves into the wet season, they go on quite a large migration, and they tend to migrate with wildebeest and a couple of gazelle species. And the zebra is considered to be the sort of the first animal that leads the migration. They're eating the taller grasses, lowering those grasses down to an area that's more preferred by wildebeest. The wildebeest come through, they're browsing on or grazing on these grasses as well. The grasses are getting shorter, and then along comes the gazelles, the larger gazelles, the Grant gazelles. The next ones eat that grass, and then they're followed up by the Thompson gazelle, which is much smaller. And I'll show you photographs of those a little later in the slideshow.
Andrew, it's Scalia. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've had a request to see if you can make your show a full screen so that the photographs are a little easier for us to see. Can you do that?
I will try, yeah.
I'm not sure either. Thank you.
Go back. Just let me, no. Well, that's the Zoom stuff. Let's see. Just hang on a second.
If it's not possible, that's okay, but it's just worth asking.
No. Whatever I did, didn't like. Oops, no. I don't know how to do that. I think it's just about.
No worries. Yeah, just continue then. Thank you.
It's got the full height of the slide, so I don't think I can make it any bigger without distorting it.
Okay, thanks for trying.
I don't know how to get rid of the top piece. No, I can't. Sorry, I'm just playing around with this for a second.
I'll just take a moment to gently remind everyone to please mute yourself if you are not muted. And if necessary, I'll mute everyone, Andrew, but then you might have to unmute yourself. So hopefully everyone can mute.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
So, okay, you haven't muted me. In the background of this slide near the water, you can see one of those safari vehicles with the roof raised up. So when the roof is raised up, you can stand up in the vehicle, which carries 8 people, to a driver and a guide, and up to 6 clients. So you can stand up under that raised roof, and you've got an open space all the way around the outside, which is optimal for taking photographs. And as I said, the wildlife basically ignore you when you're doing that. So it means you can have some pretty close encounters with these animals. A couple more zebra pictures. As you can see, the one on the left is kind of brownish. That's just a young one, and they'll get their full sort of black and white color as they mature. Here's a group of zebra at a water hole in the Serengeti. As you can see, even though we were there in the dry season, we were very fortunate that the grasses were pretty green. So it had some rain. It actually rained while we were there. So the grasses were actually greener than they often are at this time of the year. So as you can see, all these zebra are nice and fat and plump and all ready for their migration, which will be starting up within a couple of months of when we were there. As I said, they often migrate with the wildebeest and the gazelles, and they move north as the wet season arrives, and they go right up to the Mara River, which is you've probably all seen the videos of when the wildebeest cross the Mara River. It's full of crocodiles, alligators, one or the other, and that just wait there to kill the wildebeest. The zebras seem to be smarter. They won't cross the river. That's as far north as they go. This is a really interesting tree that we saw quite often in parts of Tanzania. This is baobab tree. It's one of 8 different species that occur of that genus that occurs in Africa. And the flowers of this tree are very interesting. They open up at dusk, and then they're open through the night, and then by the next morning they're finished. And apparently, when they open up so quickly that you can visually see them open up. It's not like a stop frame kind of stuff. And in just a few seconds, they get fully open. This tree, once the fruits are fertilized and they go to seed, has quite large fruits. And you can see with a trunk like this, they use that trunk to store water during the dry season. And these trees are obviously important nest sites for birds. Here's the animal that everyone wants to see in that area, the lion. Lions are mainly active at night, and they tend to prey on the different ungulates, the different hoofed mammals, everything from a gazelle all the way up to a water buffalo. So, and we probably saw on the first day, this photograph was in the Serengeti. We're probably only about 20 or 30 feet from this in our vehicle. So you can see it's not even looking at the vehicle, it's just looking around at other things. So you get some wonderful photographic opportunities. Now this hill on the left has a Dutch name, as many of the things in Africa do because of the Dutch history. This kopje is basically an area where you've had hardened rock, and all the surrounding landscape is being sort of eroded away, so that you end up with this rock outcrop. As you can well imagine, it's a perfect lookout spot for things like this lioness and other animals. Now, the other cat that we were really interested in seeing, this is a cheetah. And this cheetah was one that we found that was radioed out on to the drivers that somebody had found one right beside one of those rock outcrops. By the time we got there, it was almost totally surrounded by vehicles. And it's not, as you see, it's not perturbed at all. Cheetahs have these really neat black tear lines on their face that are very distinctive. And the spots are solid and black. So this is an easy way of telling them apart for things like apart from a leopard. Later on in the day, when we were all by ourselves and nobody was radioing about anything, we encountered this female cheetah that she was just going out hunting with her 2 cubs. We had a bit of a discussion about whether they're called cubs or kittens. Probably either one is accurate, though. The mammal book I was using described them as cubs. And these guys were just walking in a straight line. We drove out, got out ahead of them, parked the vehicle, and they just kept on walking. They just walked right towards us and right past the vehicle. So again, wonderful photographic opportunities. And these guys the cubs are just learning how to hunt. So they're probably just old enough to go out with the female. Cheetahs are kind of interesting cats because they can't fully withdraw their claws like a house cat can. So the claws are always half out. So they tend to get worn down a certain amount. And the 4th cat that we saw on that very same day, which is not seen very often there, is the serval. Serval's it's a smaller cat. It's probably about the size of our lynx, but it's got very long legs. So they're really, really adapted for running fast. And they eat sort of small rodents, rabbits, and even birds if they can encounter them. The one we saw was initially was lying beside the road, just finishing up eating some form of bird. Many places we would see these common warthogs, especially around, they seem to really be attracted to wet and muddy areas. It's a sort of a medium-sized pig, looking pretty fierce, the one there on the right face on. They're diurnal. They're called warthogs because they got these heavy, warty pieces of skin underneath their eyes. And they're diurnal, so they spend most of their time foraging or grazing in the daytime. And they actually spend their nights apparently hiding in burrows. I thought that was kind of an interesting protection mechanism that they have. And these guys are really common food for things like leopards and lions and hyenas. So I'll switch away from mammals for a period here and talk about some of the birds that we saw. These are 2 examples of rollers, the European roller breeds in Europe, but it overwinters where we are down here in East Africa, whereas the lilac-breasted roller is a resident. And you tend to, when you usually find one, you find the second one. They're hanging around in pairs a lot, and they're a very colorful bird. As you can imagine, in a country with all those mammals and other kinds of animals, there's a lot of death. And when you have a lot of death, you need the cleanup crew. These are examples of a couple of the different kinds of species of vultures that you get there that you commonly see around most areas, both in trees and on the ground, cleaning up dead animals. So we didn't see nearly as many skeletons and stuff as you'd expect, because I think that the vultures come in, they clean up most of the meat, and things like the hyenas and stuff will come in and eat more. They can actually crush the bones with their powerful jaws. Part of the cleanup crew is a completely different size and a different group. This is an example of a dung beetle. As you can imagine, on an area where there's large herds of grazing animals, there's a lot of dung production. If you've ever been by a group of elephants, you'd be amazed just how much dung there might be left around on the ground. And these dung beetles are absolutely amazing. They can they roll up these balls, and then they dig a hole, and they'll bury the dung. And apparently they can bury in one night up to 250 times their body weight. So even though they're very small, and there's obviously a lot of them out there, I guess over time they can make a lot of this stuff sort of disappear below the surface. And of course, it's great for fertilizing the soil as well. We just put in a couple of examples here of flowers that we saw. There's orchid on the left and some form of a lily on the right. You can see the upper right is the one when the flower is still in bud, and then the lower one shows what happens when it fully opens up. It might be some sort of it looks to me like some sort of an onion or something, but I need to put these into iNaturalist to get somebody with more knowledge to identify them for us. Storks are a really interesting group of birds. There are several species there. This is an example of just a couple of them. The marabou stork on the right he's got a wingspan of about 12 feet, so it's quite a large bird. It tends to be a scavenger by lifestyle, and they'll nest in trees. The saddle-bill stork is more of a traditional sort of heron type of bird, and they tend to catch a lot of fish, and they catch the fish by actually stabbing them with their beak. Third kind of stork that I'm showing you here is the yellow-billed stork. It's often called a wood stork. It's non-migratory, and instead of stabbing its fish, it puts its bill into the water where there could be fish, and the bill tip is very sensitive, and they actually feel the fish, and when they feel the fish, they grab it. So they're not using their eyesight like a heron would to get fish. They do it by touch. The Goliath heron on the right lives up to its name. That's the world's largest heron. That tends to be a solitary bird. It's very territorial, so usually only sort of see one at a time. Where some of the other herons, like the black-headed heron here, you might see more of them. The black-headed heron is a resident of the area. Moving back into the mammals, these are olive baboons. Usually when you find one, you'll find 30 or 50 of them. And we saw quite a large troop that was just walking along beside the road, and they have a whole combination of different ages and stuff. The baboon on the right is a male. It's got quite a large ruff, whereas obviously the one on the left is female with a young one hitchhiking along. They're omnivorous, so they eat just about anything. Another one member of the monkey family is the vervet. Vervets tend to spend most of the time down on the ground, and they'll use the trees for roosting and probably for escape. They're predominantly, as I said, terrestrial, and they avoid the really dense forests or the really open grasslands. So they're sort of in that interface savanna woodland kind of habitat. And they're a very large, complex group of monkeys. They're quite variable. As you well know, there's lots of different kinds of antelope in Africa. I'll have a few pictures here of just some of them. The impala is a magnificent one. They all seem to have lovely but different horn variations. It has you can't see it unfortunately in this photograph. They have very distinctive black stripes on the back of their thighs that helps identify it. And they this is unlike the gazelles. They avoid the open grasslands and tend to stay in the woodland and brushland where they have more sort of hiding and escape territory. Common eland is the second largest antelope in Africa. It's highly migratory. As it with all these guys, they tend to be herbivores that graze on the various grasses. The hartebeest has this very sort of elongated face with the interesting curved horns, and it tends to be more of an open grassland species. So you get a lot of these out on the areas like the Serengeti, which is a very, very large, extensive grassland complex in northern Tanzania. The Serengeti actually is an indigenous word that can be interpreted as endless plains.
Endless plains.
The Grant's gazelle is the larger of the two gazelles I'll show you here. As I said, they tend to follow the zebras and the wildebeest on migration. They're very, very common. They estimate there's probably about 50,000 of them in the Serengeti alone. And they have these prominent white stripes on their face with the long horns. The smaller gazelle is the Thompson's gazelle. It's got this prominent black stripe along its side, so that distinguishes it quite easily from some of the other ones. And it likes the really short grass, so that it's very hard for predators like lions or something to lay in ambush, so you can see them coming from a long distance. It's interesting when these different animals migrate together, things like zebra and wildebeest. The zebras apparently have got wonderful eyesight, whereas the wildebeest have very good sense of smell. So they kind of work together, and any sort of alarm call from one or the other alerts the others that there could be danger around. One of the smallest members of the antelope group that we saw was this dik-dik. These guys tend to be more in the shrubs and trees. They're browsers rather than grazers. The adults bond for life, and they're sort of common in sort of northern Tanzania. They're probably about I don't know, 14, 15 inches high at the shoulder, so they're quite small. And as you can see, they can be hiding in the bushes there, and every now and again, one will suddenly look down out of the vehicle, and it will suddenly appear. They're a nice combination of species you'll get there, the savanna and the African buffalo. The buffalo is a very large and stocky grazer and tends to stay fairly close to water. It's active early in the morning, later on in the afternoon, and it's very common in areas like the Ngorongoro crater, which I'll show you pictures of in a short time. Common wildebeest, I've talked already about these with the zebra. And you start to see some of the numbers. This is in the southern Serengeti, and at this time of the year in the dry season, you can see the herds are starting to gather together. And in the end, you'll see thousands upon thousands of these everywhere you look. They're very social animals. As I said before, they migrate north in the wet season. Another name for wildebeest is gnu, G-N-U. If you thought that's what they were rather than wildebeest, it's the same name. They're probably the most abundant large game species in the area of Africa.
No, I didn't know that.
Their calves are
It is the second largest
This is from worldatlas.com.
Sorry, my iPad is disagreeing with me. I've never had that before. Yeah, so the calves are one of the favorite foods of hyena. And as you know, as we sort of discovered in our explorations here, there's kind of a whole sort of a chain of dominance about who eats whom in this area. Yeah, switching to birds, this is the lesser flamingo. It's not as common as the greater flamingo, which is the other flamingo we get there, and it's slightly smaller. These guys have got very specialized food habits, and they're basically after sort of the algal films that you'll find on the muddle on the bottom. So this is a picture of the Ngorongoro crater. The crater is the world's largest inactive volcano, or caldera, as they're often called. And the name comes from the sound of the cowbells that the indigenous people would hang on their cattle. And that ringing sound apparently is where the crater gets its name. Now, over the years, they've become more and more restrictive about what you're allowed to do in the crater, and now it's part of quite a large conservation zone, which is really great. They've removed all the domestic grazing from the bottom of the crater, again, which is great. And there's a road that comes down one side of the rim and kind of meanders all over the bottom of the crater and up the other side. And it's a marvelous area for viewing wildlife. This is the picture of one of the springs, one of the main water sources in the bottom of the crater. You can see the caldera rim up at the top there. So it's not that deep a crater, but it's very wide and expansive. And you've got like shallow water bodies and spring sources and stuff, and some of these open woodlands. So you get a lovely habitat diversity for the animals. This is one of the native villages just on the up on the top of the rim of the crater. So this is where there is a lot of on the outside of the caldera. So here you'll have quite a lot of domestic grazing animals. They're all sort of mixed up with the native zebras and stuff. So they're not a species, a group of birds that we have in the Americas, but they're a very interesting group in Africa. They're mainly terrestrial birds of the open grasslands. They tend to be quite wary and watchful, so they'll tend to spook quite easily. The Kori budget there, Kori bustard on your right there, is Africa's largest flying bird. So that's as big as they'll get. The male Kori bustard during mating season puts on this really neat display where they inflate that sort of balloon on their throat, and they use the leks the same way some of our grouse species do, where they'll do this elaborate display on these specialized areas for attracting in a variety of females. As you find all around the world, when you get to the wet, muddy areas, you'll often get these puddle parties of butterflies forming. This is one of my favorite bird photographs. This is the gray-crowned crane. This crane is the national bird of Uganda. And they have very elaborate breeding behavior where they, much like our sandhill cranes, where they do a lot of dancing and bowing and jumping around to try to attract the female birds. We saw this in several different areas. And it's probably about the same size as our great blue heron or our sandhill crane. Two very strange birds we encountered here. The one on the left is the hammercock. That's a Dutch word that makes reference to the sort of the hammer-like shape of the head. It's an aquatic or a water bird. It tends to eat fish and various amphibians it finds in those habitats. Southern ground hornbill, extremely strange-looking bird. is carnivorous. Apparently, they're very long-lived, and they're even though you see them walking around on the ground a lot, they will nest in trees. Another animal that seemed really strange to see running around out there in the open grasslands is the common ostrich. This is a female on the left, male on the right, being darker. They're the you know, they're the largest bird in the world. They're flightless, and they're also the fastest bird on land. So the peregrine falcon is considered to be the fastest in the air. This guy's the fastest on land. They also lay the largest eggs of any other land animal of any phylum. As I mentioned, they like these open grasslands. You just tend to see them in pairs like this. But you see from their size, you can see them from a long distance away. One of the interesting eagles we encountered was this long-crested eagle, obviously named for its top knot. It's a bird that sort of hangs around the edges of forests, so you won't get in the dense forest, you won't get it out in the open grasslands. It will breed, it tends to breed in areas wherever there's abundant food available to it at a time, so it can be quite a mobile species. We're going into one of the national parks we stopped for lunch at a designated picnic site where you were allowed to get out of your vehicle. We encountered a pair of these pearl-spotted owlets. They were calling sort of constantly, very much like our pygmy owls. They call both the day and night, except during the breeding season when they get quite quiet. They eat mainly insects and stuff, and they are cavity nesters. This bird, when you're looking at it, you might not recognize right away, but this is the raptor. It's a bird of prey, a secretary bird. It primarily spends its time down on the ground like this. It's got very long legs. It can run very fast. And when it catches its prey, whether it be a small rodent or a large insect, it tends to kill them by stomping them with their feet. When they do fly, which is not very often, except when they're really threatened, they have these two long feathers that extend out past the end of their tail. So very distinctive profile to them while they're flying. I included these two birds just primarily because of their interesting names. They're both finches, they're seed eaters, and the red-cheeked cordon bleu. I always thought was something you'd order at a restaurant, not see out in jumping around on the ground. We saw two different species of these, the red-cheeked and the blue-capped. And I just thought the cutthroat finch was one of those it's an obvious name for it, really neat name. And I thought it was interesting that we're just getting to that stage now. It appears that they want to get rid of all the bird names where birds are named after people because they're never quite sure about what those people were like or what their history was like. So these are, I thought, a couple of wonderful examples where that's happened already. Back into the mammals. Again, going to some of those rock outcrops. We see little colonies of rock hyrax. They're about, I don't know, 14 or 15 inches long, basically almost like a tailless rodent. Bush hyrax is more of an arboreal species, but you often get them mixed together, the rock and the bush. And interesting enough, the other mammal that they're most closely related to is elephants. Don't ask me why that is. That's just one of those facts we were told about. You can't go anywhere where there's water without seeing hippopotami. Here we see a group trying to stay cool during the daytime. They'll tend to spend much of their time partially submerged. They come out, they remain in the water to stay cool. If it's really sunny and hot, they'll submerge themselves even more. And these guys' closest relatives are whales and dolphins. You see the next picture, you'll see why it kind of looks like a beached whale. Hippopotami are very dangerous. They're very aggressive and unpredictable. And we're told that, whatever you do, never get between a hippo and its water body, because it'll just run right over you. Here we've encountered a little family group of hippopotami in one of the rivers, and their ears and their eyes and their nostrils are all very high up on the skull, so they can basically submerge almost all the way and still be able to see and breathe. And you'll often in a river, you'll have every couple of 100 meters, you'll have a family group like this of rhinoceros, and you get the males will have this large sort of a very loud roaring sound. It's like declaring this is my territory and stay away from it. And then you'll get the next group downriver sort of repeating the information, and it helps them stay apart. The black rhinoceros, unfortunately, is not what you would call a common animal there. We saw in the crater, I think, a group of about 5 of them when we were up on the rim looking down into the crater, so they're very far away. In one of the national parks we got to, there was a large, very large area, conservation area that had been fenced, and there was a rhinoceros sanctuary, and they had these breeding pairs of rhinoceros in the sanctuary. And to go in, they'd be familiar with the parks vehicles. So you'd have to transfer to a parks vehicle to go in and see them. You see this guy's got the transmitter on its leg, so they know where all the animals are. And they kind of radio that vehicle's driver to get them to be able to find these animals, because as you can see, this is a very thorny woodland situation. They have very thick layered skin, and that's in part to protect them from some of these thorns. This particular animal was the female. The male was just a little farther in the background in one of the other photographs we took. And they were together because it was mating season. And because she recognized the vehicle we're in, she didn't charge. But you get an animal like this that's only about 10 feet away from your vehicle, and if she lowers her head and charges, that vehicle is going to go tumbling. So we were a little nervous to be this close to her, but she was well behaved. The African buffalo, also known as the Cape buffalo. This is one of the older bulls. You can see he's probably been routing around in the mud, so he's pretty filthy. They tend to be, they are grazing animals. They like to stay fairly close to water. They'll rest their animals, rest in the middle of the day. We saw one swampy area in one of the national parks at sort of midday, and there was a whole herd of Cape buffalo just lying down in the mud, trying to rest. And one of the lodges we were in, when we were visiting the crater, the lodge was up on the top of the crater wall. We got there right around summertime. One of these guys wandered in onto the hotel lodge ground, so we're all sort of being warned to be very careful when we went outside to go to our rooms to not antagonize that large bull that was roaming around. Jumping back to birds, this is kind of the Asian equivalent to our hummingbirds. The Asian or African, equivalent to our hummingbirds, the sunbirds. So this is just 3 different species we saw. They tend to be quite variable, but usually very brightly colored, at least on the head and shoulders. They are mainly nectar eaters, and if the trumpet of the flower is too long for them to get their tongue down to the nectar source, they'll often puncture a hole in the side of the blossom to get at that nectar. And then there's a whole other group of birds called flower piercers that are similar to sunbirds that will nectar the same way. Now, my favorite bird, I think, at least the favorite North American bird, is the American kestrel, which I like so much that we named our dog after the kestrel. So I had to put in a couple of pictures here of kestrels. This is a pair of greater kestrels sitting on one of the thorny trees out in the middle of the Serengeti. And I can't, looking at the photograph, if you look in the background, you see all those little black dots. We can't remember whether those are bugs hanging around the birds or whether they're flying birds in the distance. So I'll leave that one up to your imagination. The other kestrel we saw was quite a bit smaller in different kind of habitat. You can see it hanging out here in cacti, the gray kestrel. Kestrels tend to like sort of open grassland and open shrubland as long as they got perches to sit on. And they eat a lot of things like lizards and grasshoppers. Another interesting group of birds we saw several species of were the hornbills. These are examples of just a couple of them. They're a very distinctive group, obviously, because of their bill shape. Interesting enough, these guys are cavity nesters, so they're using cavities that are excavated, I guess, by woodpeckers primarily. You can imagine it has to be a pretty big cavity for get a bird this size into there. And they eat a lot of insects and different kinds of fruit. And it's quite a variable group, and there's quite a lot of species of hornbills. Getting into a couple of waterfowl, I thought the knob-billed duck was extremely interesting, especially the male there with that big bulge on its beak. And then the red-billed teal is much more like our North American teal. The knob-billed duck is a dabbler, so it tips up just like a mallard would to feed on bottom and shallow waters. And interesting enough, it's also a cavity nester, whereas the red-billed teal will build a sort of grass-lined nest on the ground. A couple more water birds. One's the blacksmith lapwing. It gets its name because it's the lapwing call is sort of like the tink, tink, tink of a blacksmith's hammer, apparently. And the pelican is one of the world's largest species of pelican, is one of the world's largest pelicans. And they tend to be have a group that are both residents and another part of the group that are migratory. Barbet is a group of quite a large group of sort of forest and woodland birds. This is the wonderful example of one of the brown-breasted barbet. I kind of really like the composition of the photograph. Grosbeak weaver is a bird of sort of the cattails of wetlands, and as with all the weavers, they build these elaborate sort of spherical nests. This one is known for the very fine threads that he uses to weave the nest. And you can see it's a very elaborate structure. This whole wetland where we saw these guys, there's quite a few pairs of them with nests. Some of the other weavers you'll get a whole group of these woven nests hanging in trees, and they're made from a variety of different leaf shapes and stuff. They're a colonial nester most of the time, so that helps. When you find one, you'll find lots. Now this is a guinea fowl. It's not like the kind of guinea fowl that you normally get in a North American farmland, but farmyard, I mean. But this is it's a very gregarious species. And the group we encountered, there was about 20 of them in the group, and they're like pheasants and stuff. They tend to they'll just run away rather than fly. They are able to fly, but they tend to run. And they're much less common than the more widespread, the helmeted guinea fowl, which is the one most of us have seen before. Now, this interesting landscape is the Olduvai Gorge. And this is something that I'd heard of since school days about the work of Dr. Leakey on finding early evidence of human evolution to different skulls and bones and body parts. And apparently, you can sort of see on the left side of the photograph there, if you sort of go down through the different layers, there's 3 or 4 apparently distinct geological layers that are exposed there. And that's why some of these earlier human remains have been exposed in one form or another. So this is kind of in a way you could almost consider it to be sort of the beginning or the cradle of civilization. And they've done a very nice job of protecting this area. There's a really interesting museum interpretive center that they've built on site, and it's definitely, if you're ever in the neighborhood, very worthwhile visiting. While we're there, we saw a couple of very interesting colored lizards. These are both the gamma lizards. This sort of color variations. There might be sexual differences as well, and they tend to be, a fairly fast running lizard is how they escape, but they like to stay warm, so they're often out sunning themselves. This monitor lizard is related to a Komodo dragon. They're venomous, but apparently the venom is not fatal to humans. And they're as they get bigger, and this is an adult one you see here, they'll sort of switch from invertebrates to vertebrate prey. And they'll actually catch like small antelopes and stuff by actively pursuing them. So their hunting technique is to run really fast and sort of catch these antelope and stuff unawares, which I never thought would, a lizard would be what's the word? Would be considered dangerous if you were a mammal. A couple of nice skinks on tree trunks, very colorful animals. Switching to dogs. So jackals are basically the African equivalent of a North American coyote. So they tend to be, they'll eat just about anything. They're very adaptable to the different habitats and different situations. In the Angara crater, they were quite common, especially the golden jackal was. And they're like, they'll form sort of lifelong pairs between male and female. The black-backed jackal is especially very common out on the Serengeti plains. Now, this is an animal I've always wanted to see, the painted dog or the African wild dog. When we were visiting the one park with the conservation area with the rhinoceros, black rhinoceros, there's another area, that conservation area, where they had a very large penned area where they had a population of these wild dogs that they bred. They feed them and they breed them there. And once they're producing juvenile animals, the juveniles are taken out and reintroduced into the national parks, because this animal's been persecuted a lot over its existence, very much like our North American wolves. So it's really neat to see these conservation efforts to have a breeding program and a reintroduction program back into the national parks. So it's somewhat maybe optimistic that things are going to be better in the future. He doesn't look particularly fierce here, but again, they have very strong jaws, and they're quite competitive. When a piece of meat was thrown into the pen, they all tend to almost get into a fight to see who gets it. They're very social animals. You tend to get these sort of family groups of maybe 6 to 12 adults sort of traveling and hunting together when they're out there in their natural environment. The spotted hyena, that's a very interesting animal. You can see it's built to run. It's got very powerful front shoulders, and as I mentioned earlier, their jaws are so strong they can crunch bones and stuff. They eat medium to large ungulates. They'll hunt them in a pack and try to take them down from behind by first of all crippling them by their hind legs. And again, they're a very social species. When we were driving along one spot on the road, we stopped to look at some birds out of our vehicle. I guess we'd stopped the vehicle right over where there's a big road culvert. And all of a sudden, there's hyenas coming out of either end of the culvert out into the open. There was quite a group of them. These two long claws reminded me of our North American meadowlarks. They live in very sort of similar grassy habitats. They sort of sit up and you know, their call is quite loud and prominent. There's many different kinds of kingfishers. I just used a couple of examples here, the gray-headed and the malachite. They're the kingfishers vary from being solitary, like these two guys. There's one that was called a pied kingfisher, which is black and white kingfisher, and you get them in large colonies, and they nest in burrows like our kingfishers do, and in sort of mud banks and stuff. And I think in the one lake we're at, there's probably several hundred kingfishers all in this one colony. Another one of the marvelous raptors of Africa, the martial eagle. This is one of the larger, most powerful eagles that they have there. And unlike some of the eagles, they do their hunting while they're soaring to discover their prey, as opposed to sitting and waiting for something to show itself. They're considered currently endangered, I believe. And as I said, they're quite large. They have a wingspan of probably about up to 7 feet. You see here, he's just sort of in the process of finishing off his lunch. This little cute guy is the dwarf mongoose. A set of tunnels and termite colony. They tend to, you have sort of family groups of maybe 8 or 10 of these. They're diurnal, and they're the smallest carnivore in Africa. And here's one of that same colony, sort of in the evening sun. They're out there to get the last of the warmth before it gets dark. You think at first that these are bald eagles? No, they're African fish eagles. They have more white on the shoulders than ours do. The same as ours, though they take several years to get that full color. And they just tend to hang around rivers and lakes and stuff because, as I said, their primary food source are fish. And they have special structures on their feet, like our osprey, to help them grasp fish when they catch them, so they don't tend to lose them once they got their claws into them. Now, one of the main reasons why we wanted to go to Uganda as part of this trip was to see these mountain gorillas. And it's an amazing opportunity if you ever get that one. You pay quite a sum of money to actually visit one of these family groups. You're basically paying for an hour with the family. And in Bwindi National Park in Uganda, they have about 7 of these family groups that are habituated to people. They have a couple of rangers that will hang out with them all day long, and until they bed down for the night. Then the rangers will go back at first light. So when these guys are waking up and starting to eat breakfast, there's a couple of rangers with them. So when your client group comes in, is led into this site with other rangers, and it can be quite variable. You can maybe walk up to an hour and a half or 2 hours in pretty steep terrain to see them. They know where they're in communication with the other rangers, so they basically lead you right down to the family group. They ask you to stay back 6 or 7 meters, but the gorillas don't understand that. And when you're just sort of standing in an area where you really can't move very much, the gorillas often come quite close. And one on the upper right there is the only photograph we were able to get of one of the male gorillas. That's called the silverback, and he's the dominant breeding male for that family group. Here's a lovely close-up, and it's, you probably have heard this before, that probably more than 98% of their chromosome makeup is the same as humans. So you can kind of see you can kind of see where we might have evolved from. The Yambura Gorge was an area that is inhabited by chimpanzees. And the other part of our trip, we really wanted to go on a chimpanzee trek. And so we're fortunate. We drove into the parking lot, which is at the top up in the grassland, and then we're supposed to go on a hike down into the gorge and walking around with some of the game trails to try to find chimpanzees. We drove into the parking lot, And there, about 100 feet away from us, was this large fig tree, and it had chimpanzees in the fig tree already. So we had about 100-foot walk through over flat grassland to actually see them. It was the gorillas. I think we walked about more than an hour down a very steep mountainside that we had to climb back up again at the end of the trip. Here's one of the chimps up the tree eating figs. Now, chimps are chimpanzees, and gorillas are apes as opposed to monkeys. They're in the same primate group. But these chimpanzees, when they're up there and there's all sorts of fig fruit around, they'll examine each piece of fruit before they pluck it. If it's ripe, they pluck it and eat it. If it's not ripe, they leave it alone. Currently, baboons in the same situation will go up a tree like this and they'll pluck everything off and then just eat some of it. So, much more wasteful. So these guys are pretty smart. They want to make sure there's food there for them tomorrow in the same tree. A couple more pictures, you can see them busy eating the figs. Interesting group of birds are the bee eaters. This is an example of 3 of them, 3 different species. These guys primarily food, as you would expect, are bees and wasps and similar insects. Usually have quite interesting long tails. And because they're always looking for bees and wasps, they tend to perch out in the open. So they make lovely photographic subjects. 2 more distinctive sort of color and shape birds that we saw were the whydah and the red bishop. And to go to the chameleons, in the forested hills in eastern Tanzania, closer to the water, where there were more forest and denser woodlands, we were fortunate to encounter this local fellow that was known as the Chameleon Man. And so we hadn't seen any chameleons on our trip, and we encountered him. And within 5 minutes, he had found 3 different species of chameleon in the vegetation. He had an unbelievable eye to be able to spot these guys. And it was kind of neat. We went out, we were staying in the little village, we met him, and we went out on a night walk that evening with him. And he found several more chameleons and other interesting insects and stuff that tend to come out after dark. So it was kind of a really unusual but very exciting encounter. And the pygmy chameleon he's probably only about an inch and a half long. So kind of hard to get scale. More of the birds we saw, I just wanted to illustrate this superb starling. Many of the starlings in Africa are very brightly colored like this, unlike the ones that we're more used to. Two well-named swallows. I love it when birds are named in an intelligent manner. So if you saw these, would you not call that a red-rumped swallow and a wire-tailed swallow? We love these birds. There's a couple of different species of go-away birds that we saw. And when they're startled or frightened, their call is kind of, I guess is being interpreted as saying, go away, go away, go away. Hence their name. A couple of species of doves that we saw. I thought the emerald spotted dove in particular had kind of those neat bright green feathers on the wing. I'm not sure why the laughing dove is called laughing. It must have something to do with its call. Finally, in the Lamberts are on this call. They'll be amused about this. When we went to Africa, this is our second trip to Africa. When we went the first trip, we're farther south in Zambia and stuff. And Maryland's sort of target bird for us to see was the shoebill. So we spent quite a bit of time and effort and money to fly into this remote area and spend time walking around in the wetlands until we finally found a shoebill. Well, this time in Uganda, we're on our last afternoon, we're driving down the highway, heading towards the airport, going through these extensive wetlands around Lake Victoria. And my cousin's wife said, "Do you ever see shoebills around here?" And our guide said, "Well, sometimes." So we pulled over to the side of the road. He got out of the vehicle, hopped up into the hood, and he started looking around. And then he hopped up back down with a big smile on his face, came back into our vehicle, and we drove about 100 feet down the road. And sure enough, there was a shoebill. So it basically cost us $0 extra and 0 extra time. So we just found that quite ironic after our first experience. This really shows you, very clearly why it's called a shoebill. And if you're wondering, if you remember what the title of the show was, Giraffes, Gorillas, and Gonoleks, you might have thought, I wonder what a gonolek is. Well, here's a gonolek. This particular, we saw 2 different species. This was the rare one we saw. It lives exclusively in these papyrus swamps. You probably will remember that papyrus was originally, some of the original or earlier paper that was produced was produced from these reeds. And this is a very skulky, hard to see bird. You often hear them first. And this was one of the few times on the entire trip that our guide used playback to bribe this guy out in the open. He didn't stay in the open very long, but just long enough for us to take some lovely photographs of him. So now you can say you've seen a gonolek. When we're driving around, you never know what you're going to encounter. You'll come around the corner, or you'll be parked, and all of a sudden there's a whole group of animals jamming up the road. So this is the vehicle. Unfortunately, we didn't get a photograph of one of these safari vehicles with the roof up. You see the roof's folded down there? So that roof will pop up about 18 inches so you can stand up and see. And this is basically an extended Toyota Land Cruiser. Very, very, and they're obviously the vehicle of choice in most of the safaris. And these are our 2 guides. We had a wonderful driver who had phenomenal eyesight for spotting wildlife. He'd invariably see any animal there, he'd be the first to see it. And the other fellow on the left there was very knowledgeable about the bird population. So it was really neat spending time with these 2 guys. When we're out in some of the national parks, there aren't permanent lodges. The camps are set up with these quite I guess it's more called glamping. They're quite luxurious tents. So you'd have a tent like this. You quite likely have a living room, a bedroom, and then an enclosed bathroom with a shower for your use. So, and it was interesting. At night, you weren't supposed to come out of the tent. You had a radio, and you could radio to the main tent and get somebody to come and escort you if you needed to go out to the dining tent or something. So it was dangerous at night. You had no electric fences or anything, so the animals would obviously be able to roam all around through there to be little to discourage them. Here's another picture of one of the other camps that we're in. I just thought I'd finish up the slideshow just with a very few sort of more cultural type of pictures. This is on the local market showing the colorful fabrics and a lot of the carvings and stuff that were available. This was one of the first families that we met, Maasai families. Maasai are a very proud indigenous group there. They tend to be shepherds, goat herders, etc. And we went up this one area on the first day on this open, dry plain to see 2 or 3 different species of lugs. And there's this native fellow standing out sort of under a bush there when we drove in. Didn't think too much about it. And then he came over and started talking with us. He spoke English really well. And then he pulls out his binoculars and his cell phone. And it just seemed to be, a picture of, you and old. This was his mother here that she was busy making jewelry for sale. Here are the pineapples on the way to market. As you can see, they'll put just about anything they possibly can on a motorbike. one of the neat things about spending time in this country, fruit and vegetables was invariably, harvested that morning. You could buy just about anything at one. I mean, everything was sold along the road and road stands and stuff. So anytime you wanted, like, you felt like a fresh papyrus or something, not papyrus, a papaya, you just pull over to one of these fruit stands, and it was amazing. We went to one where we were stocking up on fruit for a couple of days with the whole group, and I think for $10 or $12, we just about loaded up the vans. The people there, their native dress tends to be very, very colorful and so exotic. And here you see several ladies busy selling fruit of various kinds. Plums, I think these were in this case. So that's the end of the talk. As I said, my name's Andrew Harcombe. I've been doing the presenter. My wife Gail was the photographer. So together we hope to enjoy the talk about East Africa.